Swedish authorities have proposed giving rights to flies. Parliamentarians want to prohibit feeding them to pet lizards and frogs. Allegedly, flies experience suffering when they are eaten. They established in documents that these insects experience certain torments, so consequently, based on the fact of this torment, it was decided to classify them as domestic animals, and accordingly to ban their capture and consumption. A fly is almost a small bird, the authors of the bill insist. They propose classifying insects as pets. However, the humane Swedish politicians didn't consider that there would be nothing to feed the lizards and frogs. And this is not the only example of absurd and frankly ridiculous legal norms that exist in the modern world. Which country has the strangest laws? Why were they passed? And why haven't they been repealed yet? The 13th century. Asia and Europe are shaken by the thunder of hooves of the Mongol cavalry. Contemporaries wrote that from the sheer number and noise of the nomadic hordes, not only people but also wild animals were petrified. The smell that enveloped the nomadic hordes surely could have put one into a stupor as well. The Franciscan monk and traveler William of Rubruck noted that the Mongols never washed their clothes, and not at all because they were slubs. The ban was imposed by Genghis Khan himself. Disobedience was punishable by death. Absurd prohibitions from the point of view of a modern person even concerned the diet of Mongol warriors. He forbade his warriors from making campfires. Their food was mainly meat, which they prepared under the saddle of their galloping horse. They also mostly drank kumis, which is precisely mare's milk. The ban on cooking food over a fire can be explained. The smoke could give away the location of the Mongol army. But as for the taboo on washing, historians still argue about it. Perhaps the nomads treated water from springs with respect and were afraid of defiling it with dirty clothes. However, these are far from the strangest laws that existed in the ancient world and the Middle Ages. For example, in 11th-12th century England, slanderers were punished in a very original way. One of the rulers of Britain issued a certain law which prescribed that slanderers, if a person was convicted of slander, had to stand in the central town square, pinch their nose with their hand, and thus spend a certain amount of time in that square. The convicts had to not only stand there pinching their noses with their fingers, but also tell all the passers-by about their humiliation. A law that existed for a long time in Newmarket also obligated the English to cover their noses. This town is considered the birthplace of horse racing. They bred horses here that were worth entire fortunes, so the authorities were concerned about the animal's health, sometimes excessively. It was forbidden to blow your nose on the street because you could directly infect a horse passing by. It was also forbidden for people with infectious diseases to go outside so as not to infect, again, that same horse. In 1797, an Englishman named John Hetherington for the first time wore an unprecedented piece of headwear, the top hat. The public was in shock. According to testimony of contemporaries, people were frightened, children started screaming, and ladies fainted. John himself was fined a large sum, and he argued in court that he had not broken any law. But a compromise was reached that it was not recommended to walk around in public places wearing a top hat. In the past, they generally loved to control the dress code at the legislative level. In that same Britain, in the 15th century, they banned wearing pointy-toed shoes. The fashionists of the time loved them very much. Often the length of the toe was 10 centimeters or even more, and only aristocrats had the right to walk around in such beauty. So if a person had a certain social status that allowed them to wear these shoes, that is, the upper and middle classes, then they had the right to do so. If they belonged to the lower class, then accordingly they could not wear such shoes that would change their status. The punishment was a very substantial fine. So that commoners couldn't even think about living like counts and dukes, a ban appeared in England in 1336 on serving a meal consisting of more than 2 courses. At feasts in the royal palace, however, dinner could consist of dozens of constantly changing dishes. Sports were also banned for the common people. Based on the fact that people were divided by social class and had a different social rank, the game of tennis was also subjected to a strict ban.
That is, a person who did not correspond to a certain social status had no right to play tennis, so only the highest-ranking officials and rulers had the right to do so. Furthermore, it was believed that tennis made workers lazy, encouraging idleness and sloth. In medieval Europe, you could get 6 days in jail for participating in a football match. It should be noted that in those times this game was different from how it looks now. It was a throng of dozens or maybe even hundreds of people who ran after a ball made from a pig's bladder and tried to carry this ball from one field to another. And during this time, they would maim each other, knocking down everything in their path. So the event and spectacle was quite difficult and very brutal. There was its own logic in the seemingly strange law of 1571, which obligated all farmers, shopkeepers, workers, and other common people to wear woolen flat caps on Sundays and holidays. A very practical law, if you can call it that. The thing is, in those years the light industry of Great Britain was in decline, and in order to boost production, the production of agriculture, the production of small and large livestock, a large market for goods was needed. In 1597, the law was repealed. However, over 26 years, people had come to love the caps so much that they began to wear them without any stimulus. And by the way, they continue to do so to this day. From a modern point of view, such prohibitions seem barbaric, but it's generally possible to understand why they were passed. However, some legal norms of the past were clearly not on friendly terms with logic, and it's impossible to explain them rationally. There are some laws that are in principle impossible to explain by the specifics of the time. It's unclear for what reasons they were passed and what their purpose was. For example, in the United States of America, in some states, a law was passed according to which whistling on a Sunday is forbidden. On what principle and for what reason it was passed remains unclear to this day. In some countries of medieval Europe, animals were tried for criminal offenses. For the destruction of grain and granaries or an attack on church property, it led to animals, cats and rats that had encroached upon church property being subjected to the death penalty, and the populace perceived this as proper. To execute a larger animal, a more serious reason was needed. For example, in Normandy in 1386, for the murder of a person, a pig was executed by hanging. Another absurd law was in effect in Great Britain until 1961. Until that time, suicide was considered a criminal defense. Those who failed to end their own lives were sentenced to a large fine or even prison. And the mayor of Milan in the 19th century decreed all residents must smile. Why? No one ever figured out. Historians only have theories. According to one of them, it was intended to attract tourists. Another version sounds even stranger. This law has its historical roots from the time of Austrian rule when Italy was under the rule of the Austrians. And it's obvious that this normative act was passed so that people would be more good-natured toward the existing government. So in the past, many laws were passed that are strange from the point of view of a modern person. Some of them were adequate for their time. Others came into being solely due to the tyranny of rulers. Amazingly, many of the absurd norms passed centuries ago continue to be in effect to this day.
In 1324, a law was passed in England declaring all whales, dolphins, sturgeon, and other large sea creatures to be the property of the reigning monarch. This might seem amusing, but in those years the price of this fish delicacy, a marine delicacy, was very high. In this way, the king and the ruling monarchy simply generated additional income. Surprisingly, the law has never been repealed and is still in effect today. For instance, in 2004, a fisherman in Wales caught a 3-meter sturgeon. To sell his catch, he had to ask for official permission from Queen Elizabeth II. Some laws, of course, were normal when they were passed, but today they seem strange. For example, it was forbidden to carry weapons into the British Parliament. King Edward II was very fearful for his health and his life. Those around him knew this and often took advantage of it in a manipulative way, coming to Parliament in full armor, which frightened him. To avoid his panic attacks, he simply banned appearing in such attire in Parliament. Another strange, but in its own way logical British law is the prohibition on dying in the Houses of Parliament.
This is because anyone who dies in the Palace of Westminster is entitled to be buried with full state honors, and the treasury, even the royal one, is not bottomless. Incidentally, a similar ban exists in several cities, for example in Spitsbergen. This is because of the permafrost, where bodies do not decompose. Furthermore, polar bears could be drawn to the burial sites and eat human flesh. Therefore, whenever someone fell ill in Spitsbergen, they were immediately transported to the mainland. In the Spanish city of Lanjaron and the French city of Bordeaux, such a ban was issued when local cemeteries became full and new plots had not yet been prepared. And the mayor of the Ceglia commune in southern Italy forbade local residents from getting sick because the municipality has major problems with medical care. In 2002, Cambodian authorities banned the use of water guns during the Buddhist New Year celebration. One might wonder, who could they possibly harm? However, everything becomes clear from the explanation of the capital city Phnom Penh's municipality. It turns out that local teenagers often filled the guns with sewage and chemicals. Moreover, they would often shoot at cars, causing accidents. At train stations in France and the United Kingdom, it is forbidden for young couples to kiss on the platform. What was the reason for this? It was because kissing couples were the cause of many train delays. The trains couldn't depart on time and, consequently, were late. It would seem, what could be more absurd than a ban on reincarnation without prior written permission from the authorities? However, in 2007, such a law was passed in China. In truth, if one delves into the internal politics of the PRC, the ban no longer seems so strange. In this way, Beijing is trying to reduce the influence of the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of the Tibetans, who lives in exile in India. If after the death of the Dalai Lama, his follower says, "I am also the Dalai Lama," and comes to the administration and declares, "I am now the Dalai Lama," the administration will say, "No one from the list of people who are about to die has informed us of this. Therefore, you are not the Dalai Lama." In the state of West Virginia, any animal hit by a car becomes the property of the driver. It sounds strange, but it seriously saves the state money on road cleanup. In Boulder, Colorado, for example, it is forbidden to place couches on the porch of a home. This strange law was also passed for a reason, as students in this city, who sometimes celebrated events or just had parties, would set fire to things while under the influence of alcohol, and a couch served as kindling for them. At first glance, one of the traffic rules in Canada sounds terribly illogical. The fact is, according to the law, a cyclist is not allowed to take their hands off the handlebars, but at the same time, they are required to signal which way they are turning by raising their hand. Thus, they can be fined both for taking their hands off the handlebars and, at the same time, for failing to signal with their hand in the direction they are turning. It's hard to believe, but the ban on howling like a wolf in public places in the city of Mobile, Alabama, has a rather compelling reason. An army unit with a wolf insignia was based in this state, and in the evenings, while under the influence of alcohol, the men would gather, drink spirits, and howl. The howling could be heard over a large area, and people were practically in a state of shock, not understanding what was happening. Needless to say, this howling greatly annoyed the townspeople. Therefore, the ban was welcomed by everyone as a salvation. It's hard to imagine that in one of the most developed countries of the Western world, marriage to a deceased person is officially permitted. However, this norm has been in effect in France from the 19th century to the present day. This was done with a noble purpose. Suppose a married couple did not officially register their relationship. If the husband died, it was still possible to have children born in that union recognized as legitimate. The latest revisions to this legal norm were made in 1959. A dam was built in one of the provinces of France. It happened that the dam broke and a great many residents of the nearest settlements perished. By a decision of French President de Gaulle, it was resolved that those who were swept away by the water would be legally reinstated as living so that their partners could marry them. At the same time, in that same France, it is forbidden to marry someone your parents do not like. For example, in 2010, Frenchman Stéphane Sage was going to marry his girlfriend, Man Sin Ma, from Hong Kong, but his parents opposed the union and were able to protest it in court. The parents intervened in the marriage process, using a law that stated if parents do not approve of an upcoming marriage, then that person has not the right to enter into it. The parents also claimed that their son's potential spouse was a foreign agent trying to obtain intelligence information through marriage. In the Western world, particularly in the USA, family law is taken very seriously. But often, attempts to protect the rights of spouses turn into anecdotal situations. A legal dispute between the famous fighter, former UFC middleweight champion Israel Adesanya and his girlfriend Charlotte Paudrell turned into a melodramatic series with elements of comedy. They lived together for a period of time, but then they broke up. She filed a lawsuit against Adesanya, stating that she wanted to divide all the property he had acquired during the period they were together, and asked for half of this property, amounting to $7.5 million. Adesanya and Charlotte had not registered their relationship and had no children together. In most countries, the woman would not even theoretically be able to claim her boyfriend's income, but not in New Zealand, where the couple were citizens. According to New Zealand law, if a couple has lived together for, say, 3 years, even without being in an officially registered marriage, the ex-partner has a right to the spouse's property. But the fighter wasn't named Israel for nothing. It turned out that at the very beginning of his career, he had transferred all his finances to his mother's management, and she maintained her son's registered capital at a zero balance, so there was nothing to take from the millionaire athlete. Moreover, under New Zealand law, Adesanya himself could claim compensation. The court denied Charlotte's claim, but interestingly, it ordered her to pay him $500,000, which was half of her own fortune that she had amassed during the same period as a real estate agent, as compensation for the fact that Adesanya had a right to her property. Often, lawmakers want to do what's best, but it all turns into a joke.